the future did not look too bright for him. Because he was not just dealing with the fact that his son had not been named Caesar, but also with the fact that Maximinus and Severus had been. This gets into one of the other big mistakes Diocletian appears to have made before stepping down. Weakened physically and exhausted mentally, there is no doubt that by the end of his reign, Diocletian was allowing Galerius to take a lead on many imperial issues. We saw last week how this new dynamic likely led to the Great Persecution, as the fervently anti-Christian Galerius pushed for the persecution to be continually widened and deepened. We see it again now in the choice of Caesars. Maximinus, who would be Galerius's deputy in the east, was Galerius's nephew, and I should mention as staunchly anti-Christian as his uncle. And Severus was a friend of Galerius's, who had served alongside the new Augustus during his wars in Parthia. In other words, both of the new deputy emperors were Galerius's men through and through. Unfortunately, it seems that Diocletian simply did not take Constantius's feelings into account when he allowed Galerius to impose his own candidates on the Tetrarchy. And I don't mean that Constantius's feelings were hurt in a touchy-feely kind of way. I mean that the balance of power within the Tetrarchy was immediately thrown out of whack. The Augustus of the West was now isolated and without allies. This did not bode well for the future stability of the system. It might not have been a big deal had Constantius and Galerius gotten along, but unfortunately it was the other thing. They did not like each other personally, and they did not get along professionally, which is no doubt why Galerius was keen to make sure he controlled both of the new Caesars. The issue of the Christian persecution amply demonstrates how opposite the two new brother Augusti were. On the one hand, you have Galerius, widely seen as the driving force behind the persecution, and certainly its most zealous advocate, and on the other you have Constantius, who did his level best to just ignore the whole thing as a disruptive exercise in pointless cruelty. With Diocletian and Maximian standing above them, the two Caesars could pull in these opposite directions, and the center would hold. But now that Galerius and Constantius were the Augusti, well, pulling in opposite directions meant that the center would be ripped in half. Or, as Galerius no doubt hoped, ripped into his 3/4 to Constantius's 1/4. In a number of fundamental ways, then, Diocletian's dream of a permanent tetrarchy was doomed the minute he abdicated. Not only was the new foursome of tetrarchs disunited, but there were two men standing outside the system, Constantine and Maxentius, who felt they had every right to be inside of it, and were prepared to fight for their inheritance. On top of that, Maximian was still hanging around on the edges in his forced retirement, just itching to get back in the game. This was not a recipe for success, and on more than one occasion, the various players begged Diocletian, the indispensable man of his age, to come out of retirement. But once gone, Diocletian insisted that he was going to stay gone. They would have to work it out for themselves. Sadly for Diocletian, though, they did not. And even more sadly, he lived to see it all, as he did not have the good sense to die quickly after abdicating, like Sulla had done. Instead, Diocletian would live long enough to see the empire sucked back into exactly the kind of running civil war he thought he had put a stop to way back in 285. And by the very end, he would live long enough to see his own personal influence count for nothing, as he would be forced to use go-betweens in an attempt to secure the safety of his own wife and daughter, who were trapped in the court of the new Augustus Maximianus Dio, who appeared to have no interest at all in granting the requests of some irrelevant cabbage farmer. I want to close this week by making a brief and sad foray into current events. As you probably know, an earthquake ripped through Christchurch, New Zealand on February the 22nd, leaving the city devastated, many of its residents homeless, and basic services like water, power, and sewage severely disrupted. The History of Rome community includes listeners from all over the world, and I have gotten many an email with the .nz tag. In fact, one of the questions I answered during the 100th episode came from a Christchurch resident who recently okay, and number 2, that the city is in pretty bad shape. So attached to this week's post at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com is a link to the Red Cross New Zealand Earthquake Appeal site. If you were thinking about donating to the show in appreciation for my efforts this week, just go ahead and pass it on over to the Red Cross. Right now, I think the good people of Christchurch need it more than I do. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 130, Lost in Transition. When Diocletian and Maximian stepped aside in 305 AD, there was a great deal of hope that their abdication would be merely the first in a long line of voluntary imperial retirements. Going forward, the dream was essentially for future tetrarchs to rule for 10 years as a Caesar, and then for another 10 years as an Augustus, before abdicating in favor of their junior colleagues, which would begin the whole cycle over again. The imperial regime would thus be perpetually renewed, perpetually refreshed, and perpetually free of dynastic struggles. The foundation for all of this had been dug and the concrete poured by Diocletian. The challenge now would be getting the cement to set. The challenge that would have to be met by the new set of 4 tetrarchs, Galerius, Constantius, Severus, and Maximinus Gaia. That the tetrarchy would eventually fall apart is perhaps predictable. That it would begin to fall apart after less than a year, however, came as a bit of a surprise. As I mentioned last week, there was tension right from the beginning. Internally, because the 2 new Augusti were not exactly best friends, and externally, because Constantine and Maxentius had been left out in the cold. I'll leave the former issue for the moment, since the rivalry between Galerius and Constantius is about to become moot anyway, and instead focus on the 2 imperial sons who had been denied what they believed was their rightful inheritance, because their rivalry with the official tetrarchy, and then their rivalry with one another, has a long way to go before Constantine will render all rivalries moot. Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maxentius was born in the late 270s AD, and was the only son of Maximian, who at that time was still just a high-ranking general serving under the Emperor Probus. When Diocletian tapped Maximian to be his fellow Augustus in 285, the expectations for young Maxentius naturally skyrocketed. Diocletian had 1 daughter and no sons, and Maximian had 2 daughters and just the 1 son. The imperial daughters could and would be used to secure dynastic alliances, but Maxentius stood alone as the only blood son of an emperor. That he would become emperor himself one day was therefore practically a foregone conclusion. But as he grew up, Maxentius found himself not really being groomed for much of anything. He received a first-rate education and all that, but in his teenage years, just as previous heir presumptives had begun to receive the honors and assignments that had marked their path to power, Maxentius was instead granted no special favors and given no extraordinary commands. With the elevation of Galerius and Constantius in 293, Maxentius's future was clouded still further. There was no hope now that he would directly succeed his father, but that was okay. He was, after all, still young. If the Tetrarchy as established was going to continue, then eventually there would be new Caesars appointed when Galerius and Constantius were promoted to full Augusti. That, then, would be his moment to shine. His marriage to Galerius's daughter certainly fanned the flames of his ambition, as that was exactly how Galerius and Constantius had been brought into the family before they were formally invited to become Caesars. But in 305, now in his mid-20s and fully ready to fulfill his destiny, Maxentius was instead slapped in the face. He found out along with everyone else that he would not be named Caesar. Instead, two men from outside the family would be elevated in his place. Some say that Galerius did not like Maxentius, and so used his influence to deny him the prize. But others say that Diocletian was explicitly trying to break the cycle of blood inheritance, and so made it a point to ensure Maxentius and Constantine were kept out. Whatever the reasons, Maxentius went into a slow burn. His counterpart in all this, and soon-to-be arch-rival in all this, is a man who needs no introduction, which is why it is about time that we introduced him. Constantine the Great. Flavius Valerius Constantinus was born in the early 270s AD in Moesia, making him just about 5 years older than Maxentius. However, due to the career arcs of their respective fathers, Constantine's star would trail Maxentius's by a good 8 years. With his father constantly away fighting alongside first Aurelian, then Probus, then Diocletian, and then Maximian, Constantine never really developed much of a relationship with his father. Not that they were in any way antagonistic towards each other, just that, they didn't really know each other. As a result, Constantine grew close to his mother Helena, a low-born woman who was either Constantius's wife or mistress, depending on who you talked to. The teenage Constantine was thus shocked when he was told one day that his father was marrying another woman, Theodora, the daughter of the Western Emperor Maximian. This turn of events was simultaneously a boon to Constantine and a potential death blow. On the one hand, his father was now the son-in-law of an emperor, and that has to be good news for your career. But on the other hand, a new marriage would almost certainly take precedence over the son he had already had with some peasant ex-wife years before. But whatever the new dynastic arrangement, Constantius never came close to disavowing Constantine, and quite the contrary, always declared him his rightful leading heir, doing everything he could to promote the boy's education and career. When Constantius became Caesar in 293, the now roughly 20-year-old Constantine was ordered to pack up his bags and head east, where he would join up with the court of Diocletian. For the remainder of the original Tetrarchy's run, Constantine would remain under the watchful eye of the senior Augustus, because, on the one hand, it was important for the son of a Caesar to be protected and to learn what imperial life was like, and so on and so on. But on the other hand, well, hostage is such an ugly word. In Nicomedia, Constantine happily entered the social and intellectual circles of the cosmopolitan city, and he furthered his education there, beginning to form the worldview that would come to change the whole world. Beyond his intellectual abilities, Constantine also showed himself to be a ready and able soldier, and in the late 290s, he served on campaigns along the Danube, in Syria, and finally, in Galerius' successful war with the Sassanids. By the end of Diocletian's run, it was crystal clear that Constantine was intelligent, personable, athletic, brave, and a natural leader of men, which is either something to be revered or something to be feared, depending on your point of view. There is no doubt that from Galerius' point of view, Constantine was